the Inspire Alex podcast.
Okay.
All right, bro. So actually, I wanted to do this because we had a really good conversation last time,
Mm-hmm.
and I really want to have you on the podcast.
Mm-hmm.
And we're gonna talk about kind of your work that you did, but now the world is changing,
Mm-hmm.
even geopolitically, global powers are changing.
Mm-hmm.
But the big change that's happening now is kind of this green energy transition,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of things are going on behind that. And you introduced to me this concept of the just transition. I didn't know. So can you tell me what that is and also talk about the work that you did?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the work that I did for my dissertation was mostly um, to look at what are the drivers of the transition to this green economy or the green. I think thematically, you could say, my interest was to interrogate the notion of transitioning to this green um, economic system or energy system. I think we'll get into that later, um, specifically energy and why energy is so important. But it's more of understanding whether this discourse is the same with, or the discourse is reflective, you could say, of the ideals that um, this aim that sorry the ideals that this economic transition wants to achieve. So you could say that the just transition as a concept came about because of labor unions. Mostly labor unions were active in the 80s in the US, and they were the ones who kind of conceptualized this notion of a just transition, because their jobs were being either the regulations around their jobs were getting too tough, either their jobs were being lost due to certain regulations, or because regulations were not tough enough. So um, American labor unions back in the 80s, they came up with this notion of having a fund, basically, that would assist workers impacted by um, the ongoing changes to regulations on um, carbon intensive industries like coal, like nuclear. These industries were subject to a lot of regulatory changes, so you had unions championing this. And then, to long story short, after years of campaigning and the idea kind of spreading and changing and taking its own life during the Paris Agreement, I think they included the just transition into the wording of the agreement, like to guarantee a just transition towards uh, a greener economic system or a better economic system. So I was curious because of my background as a banker. Um, I did my undergrad in finance, and I worked for about 3 years in the finance industry in Malaysia. And I realized that a lot of financial transactions, which are the cornerstone of certain projects, which themselves are cornerstones of economic um, projects or economic um, plans, you could say, because in Malaysia we have a very well planned out set of economic objectives. Mm, they usually don't reflect the discourse that is what accompanies these transactions. So in that sense, I've always been kind of critical of discourse that says that, okay, we are championing this and this, but at the same time on the ground, um, this is what is happening. It's business as usual. So that's where that's why I did my dissertation, specifically critiquing or examining the just transition from the lens of the lithium supply chain, because lithium is one of the minerals that has benefited considerably from this just transition discourse.
And do you feel in this world of green energy and sustainable transition, do you feel like the discourse is often not like parallel to the actual actions that's going on? Do you feel that there's often a disconnect?
I think yes, and to a certain degree there is, but at the same time there is also this gradual progression that happens, like in a sense that what you aim for is very ambitious. So you could say a very recent example is the Labour Party in the UK. They've decided to dramatically reduce the amount that they'll be spending for green infrastructure. So you have the ideals that are articulated by politicians like, okay, we're going to spend 20 billion a year to transition our economy towards a greener infrastructure, a greener economic system, or whatever terminology they use, or to ensure a just transition. In some cases, like the European Union has its own just transition fund, which is meant to assist communities impacted by decarbonizing um, their energy system. We can talk about that, but yeah, you could. It's because there's a lot of political contestation around it. Sadly, we need to decarbonize, and the reality is, the Financial Times just released a very good piece about how we have already breached the 1.5 degrees that was set in the Paris Agreement. 1.5 degrees being the Paris Agreement wanted to keep climate change at 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. We've already breached that way earlier than anyone thought we would. Of course, the goal of the agreement was more of like analyzing it when it becomes consistently above 1.5 degrees. But I think according to that particular piece, last year we already breached that 1.5. So it depends. If you could argue that if the next 5 years we have 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels every year, then you could say that that's already locked in, and the Paris Agreement has, to a certain extent, failed in that aspect, at least. Yeah.
Yeah. I think also another important part of the Paris Agreement, even though it's kind of like this, I guess, mystical thing, right? It's not anything really official, but it brings a lot of people together, which is needed for this decarbonization. But one thing I wanted to ask, so you said that this idea of just transition started in the 80s in America. Do you think now the just transition is happening only in developed countries, or is this a concept that's also applicable and happening in developing countries, which is also a lot of the times where we're getting these minerals? And also something we should mention is that you focused on minerals in your work, right?
Yeah. So that's my area of interest at the moment is this area called transition minerals. So transition minerals are the minerals that mm, we need, that are critical to this transition to a greener economic system. So you have lithium, which is very the attention is on lithium quite a lot at the moment.
Or lithium batteries.
Lithium, because yes, exactly, due to lithium batteries being a key component in a lot of products and infrastructure, which is um, critical to decarbonizing energy grids. So you have batteries which provide support for renewable energy grids. So during times when you don't have enough sun or enough wind, you have a backup which uses a
You
lot of
have to
lithium.
store the energy
You have to
somehow.
store the energy, exactly. Um, I can't remember the acronym off the top of my head. And then you have, of course, cars, right? At the moment, lithium cars are the thing that a lot of car makers around the world are um, committing to. And at the moment, China is the largest producer of cars, but also the production of batteries, because the battery is the key component of the vehicle. So vehicles range from, I mean, people usually talk about cars, but you have two-wheelers, motorcycles, you have trucks. So there's a huge spectrum of vehicles and a huge market that a lot of producers would want to tap into, right?
Sorry,
So
bro.
no worries, no worries. So yeah, that's
And we're talking about
mhm.
electric vehicles, right? Just
Electric vehicles, yes. To just be exact. So lithium is one of those. We also have nickel. We also have which is the subject of uh, contestation between Indonesia, I think, and the European Union. So Indonesia wants to refine all its nickel locally, and then the European Union decided to take Indonesia to the World Trade Organization and complain like, you can't do that. You have to export as per you can't put tariffs on it. Or and the Indonesian and the WTO ruled in favor of the EU, and Indonesia has appealed, and now Indonesia is um you could say, quote unquote, fighting back by taking the EU to court over palm oil. So that's the bit of the geopolitics element that you mentioned earlier. And you have cobalt and what's happening in the Congo. It's also been a subject of um, um, a lot of uh, investigative journalism. So I think that there's a new book out, not really new. It came out a few months ago called Cobalt Red, I think, and it examines how horrifying it is, actually, the conditions that how cobalt is extracted in the Congo, and how a lot of these countries which are promoting the just transition have an incentive to maintain the current situation that the Congo is in. But you also have minerals which have previously been exploited, but now have a renewed interest in being exploited, such as copper. So copper was really big in the 70s, I think, and then it collapsed. And now, because of all the electrification that's happening, you need more copper. And a lot of countries like Zambia, for example, benefit from that.
yeah, that's really interesting. And I mean, we're talking about these minerals which are needed for as we expand our energy grid. But I feel like also each of these minerals individually have a different kind of story.
Yes.
So just to touch upon this nickel situation that you mentioned, how is it possible that someone can control whether a country is going to refine their own minerals or not?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Like that is something weird. And I mean, one thing, I mean, I kind of studied on Africa. One thing about Africa is they have a bunch of raw resources
Mm-hmm.
and they just sell them
Mm-hmm.
and they get refined in developed countries. And this is where all the profit leaves. So I find it kind of suspicious a little bit, or not suspicious. I guess it can make sense that people don't want to let go of control.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, how is it? How I r- how is it possible that I guess they can tell a country to not refine their nickel?
I think it comes, at least to me, off the top of my head, it comes down to two factors. Basically, you have the economic factor, in which a lot of this, as you mentioned, the refiners of these products, they are located in the global north, and there are a lot of there's already a lot of infrastructure in the north that caters to um, refining these um, these minerals, right? So if hypothetically Indonesia as a country decides to, um, because they are the largest producer in the world of raw nickel,
Hmm.
and if they decide, say, no, we want all the nickel to be refined, then it has a ripple effect across um, the supply chain, right? at the same time, it also gives them more influence over price setting, which is what traditionally the North has always had. So the North controls the output of higher value added products. So they have control over a lot of the prices that these valuable minerals get traded in. When a country refines it and they get then they get a bigger say. You could argue. Um, that's probably the economic aspect. Well, but which ties into the geopolitical aspect as well. The WTO and as an organization champions free trade, quote unquote. So free for whom? That's the question you should ask. But at the moment, that free trade definitely benefits the global north more than the global south, in particular when it comes to extraction of these minerals. So that's how they kind of use this rule-based system that we have post World War II to enforce as an enforcement mechanism to control um, the balance of power, you could say. Like, and it's, I mean, some conspiracy theorists or some journalists out there, they write that the West has a need to kind of keep the South, to underdevelop the South, right? To make sure that the South is underdeveloped. And it's not, and if you look at it critically, it isn't really a conspiracy theory per se, because if you want to maintain control over your supply chain and you want to make sure that you not only have control over intellectual property, but you also have control over your costs, then it makes absolute sense for you to ensure the stability of your supply. And if a country wants to change its industry completely, that's going to disrupt the stability of your supply, right? So you're going to obviously um, kind of act against that. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. And would you say that so we talk about this just transition, would you say that it focuses on the fact that there's a new market that's going to happen and people are going to be left behind? Or does it more focus on laws and legislations to protect people within this new industry?
Actually, that's a very fascinating question. Ideally, you would want to legislate regulation which protects people in a more holistic. I don't know how best to. I don't know how best to describe it. But you want to legislate more progressive, because the thing is, that's the word. This transition to a greener economy is usually accompanied with progressive discourse, like the Just Transition Fund in the EU, which was set up as part of the Just Transition mechanism, aims to assist the communities that are disproportionately impacted, like coal communities in Poland, for example. They require retraining, reskilling, because when you close a coal mine, like you can see in the UK actually, when Thatcher closed the coal mines and started doing all that as a part of her economic policy, and when she put down the coal miners' strike, um, a lot of villages across the UK have not really recovered because there was no safety net, you could say. So the Just Transition Fund kind of wants to act as a safety net. But in truth, if you look at the geopolitical competition, right, between the EU, China, and the US, then you would get a different picture because of how the US and the EU want to catch up with China when it comes to producing batteries, specifically because the EU and China are the EU and the US are significantly behind China when it comes to producing batteries. And you can see in the US specifically, there's a lot of legislation around the Inflation Reduction Act. So Biden's Inflation Reduction Act is the flagship, but around that you have legislation for batteries, semiconductors, which kind of illustrate that, okay, yeah, this is also on top of, trying to seem progressive as a discourse, it is also about maintaining certain systems that we have at the moment.
Mhm. We'll get into how the US and EU are kind of fighting with China, but one thing I think it's interesting. A lot of people know how a lot of people, and this happened in the UK and in America with coal. Some cities were completely stranded after we kind of transitioned away, right? So I think it's good that can have a fun safety net to retrain or to make sure people don't get, left behind.
Mm-hmm.
But I think this is something we're definitely gonna start seeing a lot more, especially with AI. A lot of people are gonna lose their jobs, right? But I think same thing is gonna happen with AI, where we're gonna use the profits that are gonna be created and redistribute them to people to make sure people don't get left behind. So that's one aspect of the just transition. But the other aspect, where you mentioned the cobalt mines, for example, in the Democratic Republic of Congo,
Mm-hmm.
where many people know these conditions that they're working in,
Yeah,
it's hard to call it just, right?
it is.
So when we're talking about, yeah, we're gonna decarbonize, we're gonna have electric vehicles, we're gonna have more lithium batteries, we're gonna have, for example, we say we can power the whole economy with solar panels, but we need cobalt, we need these other minerals. We're gonna need more of these minerals. We're gonna demand
Mm-hmm.
more from these workers. How just is it that we're not doing anything to
Mm-hmm.
improve these workers' lives? How do you kind of see that, and does that tie also into what you were mentioning before between the discourse and the action?
Mm-hmm. I think, yeah, in that sense it does tie into that. But I think I'll start by answering with the line that they ask us in SOAS, like during the first week of development studies. And I didn't really get the question until actually it was not even the end of the course, but really this past few months. So the first question they ask us is like, when you study here and you look at things, you should really ask, development for whom? And again, I come from Malaysia, so in Malaysia we've had this mixed economy, which is somewhat state-led, but you also have private players. And I always had this notion that, okay, if the government can facilitate um, and the private sector can, play its part, then you have economic growth. Because my parents, they came from very hard circumstances, and within a generation, my dad could afford to send me here to the UK to study. So I felt like development for whom seemed like too v- too vague a question, because the point of development is to, I guess at that point in time, I was thinking the point of development was to enrich a country, right? To a certain extent, that is true. But even in the case of Malaysia, as I've discovered through my readings as well, there's a huge inequality that we have in our country. And there are, um, you would obviously have this in any system where you have people that gain more than other people. But you could argue that neoliberalism has allowed capital to be concentrated in fewer hands, exceptionally fewer hands, because capital, for lack of a better term, has seems to have a higher barrier of entry now. Like, you have, the more capital you accumulate, the more you can invest it in uh, different areas and different sectors. And usually, in the case of Malaysia at least, you have a lot of conglomerates who are rent seeking by nature, and productively they don't really contribute much to the economy. So we had a lot of economic growth 80s 90s, and you could argue that the reason why we're kind of trapped in the middle income upper middle income trap is because there's a lot of rent seeking that happens in the economy. Um, so the question development for whom is really important, I think. So to kind of use that, um, I guess the same rubric, you really have to ask transition for whom, because the current economic system that we have, which relies on cheap, reliable, and secure energy, right? I think a lot of people don't really understand like how it is actually kind of a big deal that you can just flip a switch and the light comes on, or you could just twist a knob and the heating comes on. Because to have to enable this standard of living, it requires cheap, reliable, and secure energy. And that's just for the individual. If you For the household, right? If you look at firms as well, for firms to operate, they require the same thing. So then you ask, how do you get this energy, right? At the moment, we get this energy through burning fossil fuels. The model of burning fossil fuels to generate energy is, well, some argue differently, but in general, the consensus will be that it came from the Industrial Revolution. It started here in the UK. People started burning. I can't remember what material it was in the beginning. Uh, Coke, I think, and then they started burning coal after that. So fossil fuels are unique in the sense that they are not only they're cheap, not just they're cheap in the sense that they're readily available, they're easy to transport compared to other. So, for example, it's easy for you to transport coal compared to transporting LNG, for example. So that's
That's
why.
liquefied natural gas.
Sorry, yeah, that's liquefied natural gas. So that's why coal is cheaper, more reliable, but it produces way more emissions. So going back to what I was saying earlier, it's the model that we have is pretty much, I guess, quote unquote, a Western model that came out of the Industrial Revolution. So now the West has turned around and said that, okay, cool, because we've had too much, we've pumped out too much carbon into the atmosphere. We need to reduce our carbon now. So the thing is, all you could argue all countries around the world have all adopted this model of cheap, reliable energy to power um, their industrial plants and to create jobs. And then from creating jobs, you can lift standards of living. And the goal of every political party on this planet, you could argue, is to ensure that they can secure a better standard of living, however, in whatever way, in whatever discourse that legitimizes them. um, and the you could say the fundamental for improving standard of living is cheap, reliable, and secure energy. So again, when we ask that the difference between the discourse and what's really on the ground, you ask who this transition is for, and I would argue that this transition is for consumers that are located um, in richer countries, and the political discourse around in these countries has always been about improving standards of living, and the governments in these countries have kind of panicked and like, okay, this could be a like you mentioned, new markets, new source of growth, apart from the imperative that we need to do this because it's now uh, a question of um, it's a question of surviving, really.
Yeah, life and death,
Life and death,
explosion, end of the
explosion.
world.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, there is a you could argue a big big gap between discourse and what happens on the ground.
I think what you said about knowing and being grateful and remembering that when we flip the switch, light comes on. When we turn the knob, heating comes on. To remember that, I think, is very important. And in the context of the Russia-Ukraine war, do you think the West kind of is taking this reliable, cheap energy that brought them the standard of living for granted? Because what did we see? Countries like Germany were willing to cut off this cheap, reliable energy. And this is not even for like all the renewable talk was thrown out the window, but they were willing to pay more for energy and give that up. And what happened? They became less competitive, but they're quickly to give that up, and it doesn't really make sense. We don't really know why. So do you think, with that being said, the West is taking that for granted and we're forgetting that the standard of living is something so important that many other countries don't have?
Hmm. Um, I do definitely think that based on my experience here coming from Malaysia and living here, that I do think a lot of people here take a lot of stuff for granted, like for us, for example, you can't have tap water back home because the water is horrible. And people here complain a lot about lime scale in their water. But I guess in that sense, it's different realities, right? And different understanding of things. Um, but I don't know too much about what happened in Russia and Ukraine. I do know a lot. Not to say I do know a lot, but I read up quite a few things about on quite a few things around how the conflict had a multiplier effect, or like an effect in the sense that it disrupted the stability of gas supply from Russia um, to Europe. And in that sense, yes, because the gas that Europe was receiving from Russia was very cheap. Once gas is in the pipeline, is significantly cheaper to transport compared to liquefied natural gas, which Qatar exports,
And
uh,
America.
and America as well. Yes. Um, so definitely, I think um, the it comes it is also, I feel, the political establishment in the West, right? They seem very uh, complacent in a sense that they believe that if they took this tokenistic, or this, I would say tokenistic, maybe that's a bit too harsh, but if they took these steps which sort of um, kind of sort of preserves their power, or at least the image of their power. So for example, being able to cut off your energy source is also trying to communicate to the world that we have achieved this standard of development, that we can get stuff anywhere else. We don't have to rely on Russia, big bad wolf, or whatever it is. And it turns out it caused inflationary shocks around the world. The problem with that is that we came out of a pandemic and there was a lot of stimulus that was pumped in by different governments across the world to keep their economies going. So inflation was already like the boogeyman in the background, and then that happened, and it definitely just pushed the inflation in all these countries way up. Um, and for what? Just to prove a point that we can do without all uh this cheap energy. And but the thing is as well, that is, I think, not as obvious, is that there is political will, right? So there is political will for governments, there is enough. If you want to turn off an infrastructure which costs billions, right, and benefits you, um, you can do it. You like Germany just turned off its pipeline to Russia, right? But at the same time, when it comes to the climate or when it comes to really investing in other um, renewable infrastructure to greenify your to decarbonize your energy mix, you don't do it. So I think in that sense, yeah, the complacency really hit them.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, not only did its political will to say also, we're developed, we don't need it, but there was also a aspect of we're not gonna take your energy and you're gonna suffer the consequences. They wanted to show also the power of you need us, but they put. Did you watch the Putin interview with
With
Tucker Carlson?
no, hmm
But yeah,
but I definitely want to watch that. Yeah.
it's very interesting. But yeah, so he was talking. Putin was mentioning, yeah. So Europe basically put tariffs everywhere on Russia's basically whole economy, and even the president of the European Union, Ursula, whatever her name is, she had like this speech to say, oh, basically Russia's economy is not going to survive. We're gonna,
Survive all these
or
sanctions. Yeah.
oh, now Russia's
hmm
economy is number one in Europe, despite all these sanctions.
hmm
So I do think the Europe, as you said, is complacent, and they don't want to admit certain power structures are changing,
hmm
and certain things about Russia's economy, and something you kind of studied with minerals is their products, are essential
hmm
to this transitioning economy.
Yeah.
So no matter what people need, what
hmm
Russia has to offer, not only resources but also technology, many things, right? So there is also a complacency. But I did want to say is that you talk about how these European countries have this consensus aspect of we want to decarbonize our economy. But on the one hand, it seems that they're not really decarbonizing, they're just carbonizing somewhere else that's not here,
Yes.
you know?
Yes.
So are they really decarbonizing, and is it really authentic what they're doing?
Um, you could say that in some sense they are decarbonizing. Like for example, in the UK, I think um, it is part of the law in the UK that they have to be net zero by 2050, or sorry, could be earlier, I could be wrong. But it's part of law, which is something that if you go to a country in the global south, they wouldn't have that, right? Like for example, in Malaysia, I'm not familiar. I haven't read up too much about what's happening, but I do know that the state oil and gas company, Petronas, which is the largest company and you could say the cornerstone of Malaysia's economy, they have indicated at least that they want to decarbonize by 2050. So you have maybe in the south, you maybe have corporates are uh, who are kind of working towards net zero or transitioning in a just way, at least on paper. Mm, the I guess you could also say that a lot of countries have been skeptical because they feel that this is again maybe a new form of imperialism because a lot of these products which are critical to decarbonizing just so happen are manufactured by American companies, European companies. So, and the intellectual property that's needed to decarbonize your energy grids are all kept behind you know, uh, IP rights and laws and stuff like that. So, mm, it is, there is a bit of a, uh, yeah, sorry, there's a bit of a incongruence, you could say. But definitely, to answer your original question, I digress. There is, of course, this you could say exporting of emissions, So I think you have carbon trading as a method to kind of capture how um, emissions can be sorry emissions can be bought or sold. It's kind of like trying to create like a solution for a market-based solution for emission issues. But these carbon markets are, I mean, gradually carbon accounting is still a nascent industry. Uh, so you have different kinds of emissions: scope one emissions, scope two. Scope one is emissions that you produce. Scope two is what your direct suppliers produce, and I think scope three is like uh, up the supply chain. So it's the up the supply chain bit that is very carbon intensive. So, for example, the UK wants to open its own lithium refinery to kind of jumpstart its battery producing capacity. It will never rival China. Like the reality is that any European country and even the US is is in a catch up mode, and they will probably not be able to catch up just because of how much capacity the Chinese industry has, but also the technical know-how. So, for example, to produce a car, an electric car in the US, it's way more expensive. I can't remember the figures. I put it in my dissertation. Um, but the cost of producing an EV, electric vehicle, in China is significantly lower than it is to produce in the US, because in the US there are different consumer preferences, but most of all there's different know-how. So this is so going back to the example of the UK, um, what there's an interesting professor. She does a lot of work on the climate security nexus, and she writes about the onshoring, re-onshoring of mining, refining to the global north, because, as you mentioned earlier, uh, because of imperialism, uh, these industries were usually, um, you could say, uh, these are kind of pushed out to the periphery. That makes sense. So the, for example, in the case of a very recent one is France with Niger, and how the change in government in Niger led to uh, the, I think, I can't remember now. It began as a disruption, but I think now probably it's no longer available to France. The uranium needed to power all its energy grids. So definitely, I
Yeah, I
think.
think there was something at first like a rise in 200% of the price. And yeah, I'm not maybe aware of what it is now. Maybe they completely cut off uh, trade, but it's definitely disruption to
Yeah,
say the
yeah.
least.
So it's always been that the case that extracting these raw materials, which is carbon intensive, has always been, you could say, subcontracted, quote unquote, to the periphery. And uh, the interesting thing is that the North wants to re-onshore it, but it doesn't really know how to do it within the framework of being green.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Talking about this France situation, how they're
Mhm.
getting their uranium from Niger, and you mentioned that the UK is building this lithium refining factories. You can have refining factories, but you do need to get the lithium or the minerals
Mhm.
in order to refine them.
Mhm.
How and are countries kind of competing to control this global supply of minerals? And if they're kind of competing, how is that happening? What kind of is going on there?
So I think most of the competition, you could say, when it comes to rare earth minerals, China has the largest deposit. But um,
As in they have the largest current reserve. of minerals within their country.
Yeah, so largest reserves of silicon, the largest reserves of um can't remember. But quite sorry, I digress. Sorry about that. But quite a few. I know for sure silicon, but there's quite a few number of rare earth minerals that they have in reserve. Um, but they have not used it. Instead, what they've done is they've gone to Africa, mostly Central Africa, to the Congo, Mozambique, and they have worked with governments there to kind of open up rare earth mining. And the West sees this, and they're competing as well.
You know what's crazy? I visited Mozambique
Mm,
and I was shocked how many Chinese
mm,
factories I was seeing there,
yeah.
and refining factories too. And you even have hotels. It's Chinese markings everywhere. It's real. It's real what's going on.
Yeah, so they are, um, I guess, expanding the their footprint there as well. In a sense that, and this is something that I think is the probably the intention behind it. Um, I feel like the only way to at least, if you were a competitor of America, the only way you would want to break American hegemony would be to um, diminish the influence of the American dollar in the global economy. And diminishing or moving away, de-dollarization is, of course, a discourse that the global south, a lot of leaders in the global south have always tried to articulate, but they've found it difficult. I think the transition to a greener economic system uniquely provides the opportunity to move away from to actually ramp up de-dollarization and to stop our reliance on US dollars, because at the moment lithium is mostly traded in renminbi as well.
In
Renminbi, the currency of China. So you could basically, there are I would say three spheres of mining. For when it comes to these minerals, you have Australia, which has a number of rare earth minerals, but they supply to also a number of countries, not just the West, but also to China. And they have been under more pressure from their Western allies to kind of reduce the amount of coal or even the amount of lithium that they're sending to China. There is a very interesting interactive map when it comes to this that is produced. I think that is run by the World Bank. That kind of shows the flow of minerals throughout the world, and you can click on countries, and it shows you how the mineral flows and where. It's very fascinating infographic. You can look it up. Um, but that would be the first sphere you could say. The second sphere is Africa, and as you mentioned in Mozambique, for example, the Congo, and other
uh,
rich African countries. Yeah.
and so I imagine one way that they acquired all these minerals is by buying them. And so this second way is they're going into these African countries, and what are they doing? Are they buying minerals there? Are they establishing mines?
Mm-hmm.
How are they going into these countries with the goal of getting more minerals? What exactly are they doing?
I don't know too much about the case of African countries, because my dissertation focused on South America, which is the third node of mining, you could argue. Um, so I guess anecdotally, from what I've read, you could argue that uh, anecdotally, it's probably just going in, signing some joint ventures with local governments, which benefit those governments, but they get to extract as much as they want with less environmental standards, by the way. So let's say what happens in the Congo would never happen in the UK, for example, because of all the environmental standards. It would be done basically, right? Um, so it's cheaper for companies to not only be there, it's of strategic interest, and also it's again it comes back to that need to have things to the need to have energy cheaply, reliably, and securely. So that's why these countries they go into um, um, African countries. They do FDI tie-ups. Like for example, in the case you mentioned in Mozambique, you have factories which may not be related to Chinese. For example, Chinese factories which may not be related directly to the extraction of any rare earth mineral in Mozambique, but they're there still to facilitate the development of the country in different aspects. So it's kind of like a package deal, you could say. In the case of South America, which I looked at specifically in Chile, um, you have Albemarle, which is the largest uh, lithium miner in the world. And Albemarle is an, a North American company which has which is one of two companies that has the permit to extract lithium in Chile. Most of the lithium comes from the Atacama Desert. The Atacama Desert is a very beautiful place based on Google Pictures, but it's also the driest place on the planet. And the extraction of lithium there is very water intensive, because what they do is they flush out the salt underneath the desert out into the like onto the surface of the desert, and they allow these pools of what we call brine to dry up and to leave behind the lithium, which is then exported to other parts of the world to be refined. So the thing is about the Atacama Desert is that it's already a place of contestation for um, water rights. The indigenous people there have had to compete with the miners for water rights because there's already the copper industry there, and the copper industry uses quite a lot of water as well. So it is, in that sense, um, um, you could argue it depends, right? Um, in China, sorry, in places in Africa, for example, in Mozambique, there is some multiplier effect or some bigger, wider development effect. But I guess in the case of Chile, there is it's more of like extraction, and then everything else just goes off into the sunset. Yeah.
Yeah. I think yeah, it's like that as well. Maybe in many African countries as well.
Mm-hmm.
Where even after the extraction, a big mess is
Mm-hmm.
left
Mm-hmm.
of pollution, dirtiness, and
Mm-hmm.
holes in the ground and oil spills, whatever. It's a reality. So you say China, and I think a lot of people can agree, are ahead.
Mm-hmm.
America has a tough time to letting go of this number one spot.
Mm-hmm.
How are they kind of fighting this war?
Mm-hmm.
Are they also, because we talk a lot, today about the chip war,
Mm-hmm.
about the informational war, and this war and on minerals and control over minerals is not really talked about, but it seems to be super important because it connects everything together. So is America responding in any ways? I mean, I'm
Mm,
sure their efforts
mm.
are still there.
So I I know again quite I guess a basic uh, Johnny Harris video on the semiconductor um, competition between the China and the US. Um, I think the reason why the US is behind is because, again, you have this idea that, okay, these are stuff which are um, at the other end of the supply chain. So it was never really like we make, for example, we make cars in the US, but whatever parts that go into the car, everyone else can make that. And we'll make the car and then we'll sell it to you. So perhaps there was this policy that all these things that are critical to securing a safe, cheap, and reliable supply chain were always going to be there because of globalization, I suppose, and how interconnected free trade is. So you're not going to stop trading with me, right? Because you need it, I need it. It's it's convenient in that sense. But we can see now that that's not entirely true.
Especially after COVID.
Especially after COVID, and how that's really changed a lot of well, a lot of stuff, essentially. Um, the the competition um, the between the US and China when it comes to green technology um, is is the way that the US is responding is through the Inflation Reduction Act. So the Inflation Reduction Act is trying to incentivize um, not only consumers to switch to greener stuff, greener cars and stuff like that, also producers to switch to um, producing greener stuff as well. So, for example, in Detroit, which was deindustrialized as globalization took off, um, there was a lot of grants that were given out both by the federal government and the state government of Michigan to attract car producers to return and produce their batteries and produce their cars in Detroit. And this particular program is specific to areas which have been decarbonized. Areas which have been deindustrialized. The reason is that I feel the West still has this imperial nostalgia that it cannot get rid of, and like I guess if you have power and it's difficult for you to give up power, you're not going to give it up so easily. And in that sense, that's why the US is competing with China when it comes to green technology. But yeah, the US is responding. I think the biggest response was the Inflation Reduction Act, yeah, which Biden passed.
So, yeah, and I think they also want to, transition into green energy. There something Elon Musk said was that we could uh energize all of America with just one small section of Texas that would be filled up with solar panels. But with that being said, that means a lot of solar panels. And my question is, do you think in this context of the energy transition, there are enough minerals on Earth to supply this energy transition that we want to have?
Um, I can't.
And this is a very objective thing, like just your opinion.
Mhm.
Some people have a no, we're very limited. Some people think there's
No.
abundantly enough. What do you think?
Oh man, I should have read my dissertation again before I had this conversation. But there is like a triple digit um projection by the World Bank by 2040, I think. All these rare earth minerals, the demand will grow by triple digits. And the World Bank in that report says it's not enough. But
What's not
again,
enough?
the supply of rare earth minerals.
Okay.
to based on current demands. But again, when it comes to these projections, it's based on current demands. And again, you ask, it's not enough for whom? Like how many people, how many cars does the average household need in the UK, or how many cars do they have? Or so again, it's a matter of not enough for whom. I personally think that there is enough minerals to transition away. It's just that we don't need. Sorry, we can't have a monopoly of technology. That makes sense. Like um, we should also invest in other technologies like hydrogen, which we have abundantly. And we don't necessarily need to just concentrate on producing electric cars, which rely on lithium or nickel or cobalt and all these minerals. So it's about creating like multiple options. The thing is, that's not attractive because um, for you to produce something cheap, you need to scale it up. And for you to scale it up, it has to be um, very easy to replicate. And when it's for it to be easy to replicate, it needs to have a set amount of raw materials that goes into it. So not just goes into producing it, but also powering it it or using a particular um, machine. So you could say that, in my opinion, I think there is enough. It's just that um, there is. It depends on. It depends on how much. It depends on how much is enough, I suppose. Like, what's the definition of enough? And whether we we decide to concentrate on simply one set of technologies, or if we decide to also invest in other technologies. Because if we concentrate on just one set, then probably yeah.
Mm,
Mm,
yeah. But one thing's for sure is that the demand for these minerals is just gonna continue to grow.
mm,
And going back to how we were talking about these cobalt mines, which
mhm,
is kind of the famous example of how terrible
mhm,
the workers have it, but I'm sure in many different minerals and mines, you have sand mines and
mhm.
similar terrible working conditions. And a lot of these uh, minerals demand is driven also by these new companies like Elon Musk's Tesla
Mhm.
or Tim Cook's Apple, uh, that are producing all this new technology that require these minerals. Do you think it should be their responsibility? They should bear the responsibility of these working conditions in the mines.
Yes,
Yes.
I think that it is um, imperative that we hold corporations accountable for what happens down the supply chain, because everything is an ecosystem. So if these abuses are happening because of demand for your product, then you need to be held accountable in some way. Now, f- I do understand the argument made by some chief executives that the supply chain, because of globalization, supply chains are so intricate, we can't really do much. But again, like we saw when it came to Germany and Russia, for example, it was easy. There was the political will just to um, shut down the pipeline and to jack up inflation, and like the general populace suffered because of that decision. So yeah, I feel like if we put our heads together and if there is enough political will, we can find an enforcement mechanism. We can invent one, and it's just a matter of, again, political will. And I do feel definitely that they should be held accountable. I do not know. Well, it could be through. I mean, I would, i- if you say fines, like how much is enough? If you say how far down the supply chain you go, because one thing that we studied at SOAS was the um, the garment supply chain, and maybe there could be some lessons from that. In Can't remember in what year there was a collapse of Rana Plaza in Bangladesh, and there were a number of sweatshops there that were supplying to brands like Primark, H&M, and that caused a big and much needed uproar in amongst consumers and amongst the business world. Like, how do you allow for people to work in such a condition, and for so many people to have died in that uh, incident, in that tragedy? So, I guess there is precedent in other sectors where there can be a more um, there can be more collective action to kind of hold suppliers accountable, to hold companies accountable, and it's just a matter of having that political will. In the case of um, these minerals, the thing is, it's very difficult because it would take some kind of um, tragedy, sadly, to happen before there is enough appetite within policymakers to make a change. Um, but at the same time, you see a tragedy unfolding. Some people say a genocide as well unfolding in the Congo, but world leaders seem to be quite mute to it. I think because the need for cobalt at the moment is just really, because I think, if I'm not mistaken, cobalt and lithium uh, are minerals that cannot be substituted. So you need them at the level of technology we have at the moment. We just need these two things. We can't substitute them. So, um, as long as that is the case, then it's very tough.
Mm, yeah, it is very tough. I think, maybe there needs to be enough will from the consumer side for, and
Mm.
it's also
Mhm.
tough because, these countries where we get these minerals are often developing countries. So even on the government side in the local country, they're probably unwilling to support these actions in any way because
Mhm.
usually they are also
Benefiting.
profiting from the
Mhm.
fact that there's not a lot of laws surrounding this area.
Mhm.
I think maybe we will see some advancements if,
Mhm.
yeah, consumers demand
Mhm.
to know what's going on and they say we will not buy from a company that gets their cobalt from this level of work standards. We'll see what happens. I definitely agree that it's a tough thing. uh, I wanted to ask you, so because you are from Malaysia,
Mhm.
I don't know much about Malaysia, but
Mhm.
they're kind of surrounded by all
Mhm.
these economies. You have China,
Mhm.
Singapore,
Mhm.
Vietnam, so they are kind of in the middle of
Mhm.
this growing sector, especially as we talked about after COVID, people are looking to trade less with China.
Mhm.
So how is Malaysia doing, and are they are they producing? Are they
Mhm.
involved i- in this
Mhm.
production that's going on, or are they more like a Singapore type economy?
So I think Malaysia is kind of a bit of both. The population, just a brief introduction to Malaysia. It's truly Asia. That's the tagline that our tourism um, our tourism ministry came up with back in the day.
What is it?
Malaysia, truly Asia. Yeah, so that's, if you go anywhere and you see it. Plus, to be honest with you, that's probably our best export. Whoever invented that tagline is pretty dope. Um, Basically, we are a population of about 30 million, I think, close to 40. We are reaching an aging demographic. So by 2050, I think we'll be a aging country. Our largest export is electronics. Electronics arrived in Malaysia during the 1980s when the government began an export oriented industrialization approach instead of import substitution industrialization. So, export oriented means that you industrialize by producing stuff for the global market. Import substitution refers to like industrialization that focuses on producing local goods instead of relying on imports from other established markets. So at the moment, our economy is not doing so well. We could depends who you ask. My opinion is that the economy hasn't been doing well for the past 15 years. We have stagnated because of a lack of productivity, lack of competitiveness. This comes down to low wage growth. This comes down to the aging demographic again, but a lot of other systemic issues around the Malaysian economy, which are difficult to solve, probably because of the quality of leadership that we have, and also some political nuances which are a bit too difficult to kind of address. But in terms of the green um, transition, Malaysia is also in the state of trying to catch up. So I think recently the Malaysian government managed to convince Tesla to open its regional headquarters in Malaysia instead of in Indonesia. So that is, I guess, that was locally seen as a big win. Tesla is also considering opening a factory and a battery manufacturing, a car manufacturing and a battery manufacturing plant in Malaysia as well, I think. Um, Apart from that, there are also Chinese companies which are coming to produce their EVs in Malaysia as well. Um, the rollout of green infrastructure is pretty slow. I think because um, energy has always been very cheap in Malaysia, very cheap relative to global standards. There's been a reliance on oil and there's been a reliance on coal, and the reason being it's difficult to decouple is because there is this ecosystem where uh, the national energy provider Tenaga Nasional is buys most of its energy supply or part of its energy supply from these independent power producers. So IPPs are companies which receive permits back in the 90s, I think, to sell energy to Tenaga Nasional to kind of create this semi semi private market. But it's the problem with that is it's very rent seeking. So you have a lot of cronies which are IPP producers. But the problem with rent seeking is that it doesn't lead to any innovation whatsoever because your point is to extract as much return as possible. And innovation doesn't guarantee
Could you
return.
say what rent seeking is?
So, oh, that's a good question. I guess for the benefit of non-economic listeners, rent seeking is the act of, um, and I hope I'm correct in this description, is the act of pursuing um, returns in economy without being productive. So if let's say, a form of rent seeking would be, um, I sell you, for example, a rare earth material that is being exported in Malaysia, for example, is bauxite. So um, I sell you bauxite every month or every year. I sell you this amount, and I'll sell it to you forever as long as there's bauxite in the ground. So that monthly income that you get, or that yearly income that you get, is called rent. Like it's not something that you have to be productive for to achieve. That makes sense. So maybe that's not a good enough example. But in the case of the IPPs, I'll try to contextualize the example. If all the IPPs need to do in Malaysia is that all they need to do is they need to produce electricity, and whether or not there is a high demand or a low demand, Tenaga Nasional will buy the electricity from them at the set price that was agreed upon in the IPP agreements. So this is rent seeking. They don't have to do any extra work to um, to change their methods of producing electricity, or to tailor their methods of producing electricity depending on peak demand or low high demand. Whatever it is, Tenaga Nasional will buy the electricity from them. So that is rent in not so many words. The problem with that is it stifles innovation. Like why would you switch from a coal plant to a solar plant, because Malaysia has a lot of sunlight, so ideal for solar power. Why would you switch to a solar power plant, which will cost you money, which will cost you the which has different costs? Sorry, yeah, obviously it will cost you money, but different costs: personnel costs, R&D costs, installation costs, uh, or EPCC, engineering, procuring, construction, and commissioning costs around the project. So you have no incentive. Bless you. No worries. You have no incentive to change your behavior, quote unquote, right, as an economic agent. So that's the problem with Malaysia. You have a lot of rent seeking in different areas, but the reason why we haven't been able to transition away from fossil fuels is largely down to two, I think, reasons. The first is rent seeking. The second is that fossil fuel has, specifically oil and gas, has a very positive reputation in Malaysia because of Petronas. And Petronas is Malaysia's only Fortune 500, I think, one of the largest oil and gas companies in the world, mostly known for sponsoring Mercedes in Formula One. But they have productions, they produce oil and gas um, all the way from Canada down to Australia, I think, if I'm not mistaken. So they're all over the world. And um, a lot of people who work at Petronas, they have good, rewarding careers. So I feel like obviously switching to renewables would also disrupt Petronas's business, and people kind of feel like, what's the point? Yeah.
I think this is relevant to many kind of rich but still developing countries, even like Nigeria, is like 90%, 97% is
Mm.
based on oil.
Mm-hmm.
And then they're talking about, transferring to green energy, but still, what's the point?
I think, sorry, in Malaysia's case, the most of our GDP comes from the electronics that we export. So like stuff like this. I wouldn't be surprised if this microphone was assembled at some point in Malaysia, or it was something like you could probably your laundry machine, or um, one of my clients back home. One of my clients back home used to do semiconductor testing, or still does semiconductor testing, which is like semiconductors are produced in China. They're imported to Malaysia. Sorry, they're exported to Malaysia to be tested on, and then they're sent to anywhere else in the world which requires a semiconductor, usually back to China or Korea. Um, so electronics is actually the largest sector, but the sector that provides the most in terms of high skilled jobs, the one that um, provides a lot of revenue to the government is Petronas still. Yeah.
And not to get into the specifics, how is Malaysia's government? Is it a democracy? Do you have a kingship? I don't know much about it. How is it? And would you say it's a stable? It's
Mhm.
stable politically.
So we've had some political turbulence this past few years, which is very uncharacteristic of Malaysia. Um, we have governance wise, we have a constitutional monarchy. The king of Malaysia is rotated amongst 9 kings. So we don't have like, for example, in the UK, you have House of Windsor as the monarch, and no one else is ever going to be monarch unless there is some change in that. But in the case of Malaysia, the different states, the different princely states, uh, have all different kings, and upon independence in 57 and the formation of Malaysia in 63, they all decided, you know what, we're going to share it. So the the Yang di-Pertuan Agong is appointed by the Council of Kings. So when, I mean, on paper they rotate it, but they also have, I guess, their own understandings. And there have been cases where kings kind of, um, how do I put this? The kings, quote unquote, have disagreements with the council, or the council feels like, okay, a certain king is not fit for purpose or whatever. So you could argue to a certain extent, the Council of Kings is the main organ of law in Malaysia, in a sense that the same way the UN Security Council is the main organ of law in the world, in the case of Malaysia, is the Council of Kings. Whatever they say, don't say, do, don't do, kind of sets the tone. Whatever they approve of, disapprove of, um, kind of sets the tone for policies in the country at the moment. Um, Underneath them is Parliament. So you have the House. So you have um, the House of uh, the National House, which is like the House of Lords here, and then you have the People's House, which is like the House of Representatives in the UK. And people who are in these two houses, they form the cabinet. But I think the prime minister has to be from the House of Representatives.
You said that in the recent years there was some turbulence,
Yeah.
which is not common to Malaysia.
Yeah.
What is this turbulence you're talking about?
So the turbulence started when Najib, who is in prison at the moment due to him being found guilty of some corruption charges in relation to the One Malaysia Development Berhad scandal.
And who is this guy?
So this guy used to be prime minister.
Okay.
And he was in 2018. He lost his that particular general election. It was the first general election I voted in as well. I remember that. So before that, Najib and his coalition, Najib had been governing for 10 years, I think, by then. But the political party that he belonged to, UMNO, and their UMNO stands for United Malays National Organization, and their coalition partners had ruled Malaysia from independence. So their defeat meant that the longest reigning coalition in the world stopped ruling. At the point, people were kind of scared, like whether that was actually going to happen. But that was actually a pretty chill transition, and I would say that was, of course, down to the Council of Kings as well. They were like, they were probably were like, you know what, this has to happen. If not, they know that stability is important. So Najib lost, and his mentor. Najib lost because his mentor Mahathir came back. So Mahathir is the guy who built modern Malaysia. You could say he modernized a lot of Malaysia. Arguably, I wouldn't be here speaking in front of you without Mahathir and his consequential decisions. He ruled for 22 years. He
As prime minister.
as prime minister, and he retired in 2003. He had a successor who then retired in 2008, I think. Uh, and then Najib became prime minister in 2009, and he lost in 2018 to um, his sort of political mentor. The thing is, and then he lost to Mahathir again. So Mahathir came back for the second time. After 2 years, I think it was somewhat of a fragmented government to begin with, because it was a patch of uh, old enemies coming together to topple Najib, because Najib was becoming increasingly authoritarian. He would have bankrupted the country, in my opinion. Um, the I think it's too much to get into, but definitely look up the One Malaysia Development Berhad scandal. It's huge, and my career in investment banking kind of coincided with uh, that scandal coming to surface. So that really kind of put a lot of stuff into perspective for me as well when it came to moving money for companies, and moving money specifically for development objectives. So Najib was toppled because of people's anger around the scandal. Um, that being said, the new government under Mahathir, the main goal for them was to kind of reform, at least, all the nonsense that had been accumulated under Najib. But after 2 years, the coalition collapsed. So you had and Mahathir went back into retirement, quote unquote retirement for him. Means that he wasn't prime minister, but he stepped down. When he stepped down, his coalition collapsed, and there was a backdoor government, in a sense, the same way that Rishi Sunak is prime minister now, and it's more of like it was unelected, basically. A guy named Muhyiddin Yassin was prime minister. He collapsed after a year, and there was another guy called Ismail Sabri who was prime minister. And then we had an election in which the current prime minister managed to gain the most seats. I think Malaysian people are very vocal when it comes to their democratic rights, because for the first time in, at least now, that's the case, because the election we had in 2022, I think 2022, resulted in a hung parliament. So it was the first time in Malaysia we had one. And then after a week, I think, the Council of Kings decided that they gave their support to Anwar Ibrahim, which is the current prime minister. But throughout this 5 years, you could say, there's been a lot of vitriol in the discourse. There has been a lot of corruption. There has been specifically Muhyiddin Yassin's government. But most of all, there has been a distinct lack of direction. The successive governments don't really know how to solve Malaysia's growth puzzle, you could say. Yeah, because we used to grow quite. Our GDP growth used to be like in the higher numbers, 7% or 6%. Now it's like single digits. Sorry, single digits, but low, like 3 or 2, just pretty much like what a developed country will be growing at. But we aren't a developed country,
Mm.
so.
And you worked 3 years in the banking sector,
Mm-hmm.
and you mentioned also that that was due to because
Mm-hmm.
of some political stuff going on.
Mm-hmm.
But with that being said, how was it working in the banking sector in finance in Malaysia?
So it was an interesting one because I had I had the goal of becoming a banker because that's what a lot of kids, I guess, who are sold this idea that you want to be a banker, you'll be well off, blah blah, and you kind of rub shoulders with important people. I come from a middle class background, so like I felt like maybe this is my ticket to a different class in life. Um, but I kind of woke up to. I thought that it was going to be like we'll be assisting companies, advising them, but in reality, it's actually a lot of paperwork, a lot of Word documents. I worked in a specific like branch of finance called corporate finance, which is where we assist companies in their corporate transactions. This could be raising shares, which is called equity fundraising. So, equity fundraising is either a primary form of equity fundraising, which is done through something called an initial public offering, where it's the first time a company offers its shares publicly to shareholders. Sorry, to the public, to attract shareholders. And then you have secondary offerings, rights issues, um, and bonus issues, and so on. Another aspect of the job was what is quite popular as a buzzword: mergers and acquisitions. So you assist companies in acquiring or merging or disposing even of their subsidiaries or other companies. And basically, these are like the two thematically, the two main themes of the job. The job itself, I think, is very um, pedantic. Um, you deal with a lot of documents. You deal with a lot of slide decks. You deal with a lot of Excel models, which all require a great degree of attention and a great degree of in I don't know what to say. In our language, there's a good word for it, but I get pedantic in the sense that it's very
What's the word in your language?
in Malay we say renyah.
Anya.
Renyah is to describe something which so in Malaysia our banking sector has a lot of regulation to it. So I wasn't just a banker, but I was a compliance officer as well. I kind of, I guess, seeing what happened with 1MDB and seeing like the amount of corruption that was happening, it was an existential moment in a sense that, okay, so I do all this compliance work for all my other clients, but this company that this prime minister had with his cronies or whatever completely bypasses all these things, and they get to do what they want to do because of power. And then for me, it was a, a moment that I guess I used to view the world pretty idealistically, and then when I got that job, I realized, okay, this is how the world kind of works.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And what type of people were around you that go into the banking sector?
Mm-hmm.
And did you meet? You said you rub shoulders with important people. This is why people go into it. Did
Mm-hmm.
you rub shoulders with any people?
Mm,
And what type
yeah.
of people were you kind of seeing in that environment?
So I think I was uh I had pretty chill colleagues. My team, I had pretty chill colleagues. They were all there to just get on with their job. Everyone didn't like being
Really?
yeah, everyone was kind of looking for what the exit opportunity was going to be, or maybe that was a function of the fact that we didn't work for the best boss. At least our teammate was a bit mad. Um, but in terms of rubbing shoulders with important people, it was a lot of networking events that I went to, and sometimes you meet somebody that has a title or has done this, has bought this company, or has um, is a industrialist in this industry, and you're like, oh, okay, cool, wow, like usually read about them in the newspaper or something like that, and here you are having a chat with them or just like a coffee at the conference or whatever, and it's pretty chill. And I realized that what, sometimes all these news articles are kind of um over, I guess, what's the word for it, over mm, sensationalize things. Sometimes, when you meet a CEO or MD of a company, it's just another guy, and it's just like, yo, what's up, how you been? Oh, you just finished school. Oh, you're working banking, cool, good for you. Yeah,
Mm,
stuff
mm,
like that.
mm.
Yeah.
Nothing
Mm,
special.
mhm,
Yeah, I think everyone is an individual person, but it's true. The titles don't make the man,
mhm,
and it's good to get away from that.
yeah,
And so you mentioned your parents grew up and come from humble beginnings.
mhm,
Can you tell me a little bit how was it for you growing up in
mm.
Malaysia?
So, my parents, they benefited a lot from affirmative action policies,
Mm,
which were introduced.
those exist in Malaysia.
Yes, they do.
Wow.
So basically, after 57, when we got independence, we had a pretty neoliberal approach towards economics and towards development, basically. Um, but I think it was in 69 where we had um, race riots where ethnically Malay, which the ethnicity I belong to.
Do you
Mm,
have how many like
mhm.
ethnicity groups do you have in Malaysia?
I actually can't. I don't remember off the top of my
Like
head.
is it in
Yeah,
the hundreds?
I would say maybe I would say in the hundreds, maybe
Okay.
it could be more than 40, 50 ethnicities, but the main three ethnicities are the Malays, the ethnicity I belong to, and the Chinese and the Indians. So they make up the bulk of Malaysia's population. And then you have other ethnicities which are more of a majority in uh, East Malaysia, like in Borneo, in Sabah and Sarawak. We can get into that. Um, but for me, my parents, sorry, we go back to 69 where there were riots. People were just going out on the streets, stabbing each other. It was not a pretty sight. Um, After that riots, the government realized that,
And those riots
mm,
were because there was race tensions
yeah,
before in Malaysia. People
yeah,
were being treated unfairly
yeah,
based on race.
yeah.
Okay.
So the thing with the British is they had this divide and conquer thing going on as per
Mm.
usual. So
And divide and rule
divide
as
and
well.
rule. Yeah, sorry, divide and rule. That was what I was gonna say. Um, the case of Malaysia was that the Malays were pushed into the rural areas of the country and they were left to their own devices, basically. And a lot of it was subsistence farming and just chilling and living off the land. The ethnic Chinese were concentrated in commercial centers and mining centers. So over centuries, they accumulated over like uh, 2 centuries probably, or even longer, depending who you ask. They accumulated capital and um, wealth apart from British industrialists. So you could say the white man was at the top of the food chain. After that, you have the Malays, Chinese, and the Indians. The Indians were my great grandparents were Indians, and on my dad's side, they came from mostly southern India. And um, they were mostly brought in to be laborers in plantations, cheap labor, indentured labor, in some cases. So this is the divide and rule that they had. And after colonialism ended, because we had a elite which was basically groomed in the UK. So at that point, the elites of the country were British educated, and they usually came from well-to-do families. So in the case of the Malays, they will usually come from, uh, they will usually be royalty, or they will be the children of noblemen. They would be given preferential access to education, and then they would usually come to the UK to study. So in the case of the Chinese and the Indians, it depends. If you make your way up and you become a businessman or industrialist, then you have enough wealth to educate your kids or your people. Um, so we fast forward to 69, and the elitists, so the elites at the time, which were Anglophones, didn't really do much change structurally to the economy. And then 69 happened. And then after that, they suspended the government for like 2 years, I think. So they had this like um, national government, unity government, sort of. And they introduced affirmative action, the most consequential decision, you could say, in Malaysia's history was to the new economic policy, NEP. So the NEP, the goals of the NEP were two. The first was to eradicate hardcore poverty. Hardcore poverty. Then this particular goal was achieved, right? Malaysia is one of the countries that managed. I think it's creeping back up because people get complacent. You know, hey, that's what it is. But I think by the time we got to the 90s, we managed to eradicate hardcore poverty substantially. I think it was gone basically. The second one was addressing the inequality amongst the ethnic groups in Malaysia. This one, I think it never really met its target. So there were targets on equity ownership, there were targets on education, there were targets on jobs. So the quotas were put in place. So if you were Malay or or not just Malay, but in Malaysia, that's the thing. We have a term called Bumi Putra. Bumi Putra is Sanskrit for sons of the soil, which is a term to describe who is basically not get into it too much, is a term to describe who is indigenous and who is not. So the indigenous communities of East Malaysia and the Malays, they make up the Bumi Putra. Ethnic Chinese and ethnic Indians are not considered as Bumi Putra. So the Bumi Putras received a lot of benefits under the new economic policy, and my parents were one of the many who received access to cheap education, which ultimately changed the trajectory of their lives. Without those policies, then I don't know, they probably would have gone to uni. Maybe we couldn't afford it or something. So yeah, I grew up from there. Grew up in a suburb south of Kuala Lumpur, a place called Cheras, which was specifically a place called Bandar Tun Hussein On, which was formerly an estate, I think, and then they changed it into a housing development, which is pretty common in Malaysia, by the way. Estates becoming suburbs.
Do you have any siblings?
I am the middle child. I have an older brother and a younger sister. All of us are Well, I'm approaching 30 in October, man. My brother's 31. My sister's 28, I think. Yeah. So we grew up, yeah, pretty middle class. I think we income wise we became more comfortable when my dad kind of um, his corporate career took off, which was at the end of my high school. Yeah, that was when we started doing better for ourselves. Yeah.
You even mentioned at one point your dad studied
Mm-hmm.
in America in Chicago. So you
Mm.
did 1 year in the US.
Sorry, my dad studied in Michigan.
Oh,
Yeah, he
Michigan.
did his master's in
Okay.
Michigan. Yeah, really cool place, Michigan. Yeah, we were there for 2 years, I think. Yeah, we were there for 2 years.
Oh, 2 years.
2 years or 3 years. Can't
And when
remember. Yeah.
was that during your high school days?
Oh no, that was earlier. That I think was when I was a kid.
Uh,
I have vaguely fond memories of it. That was before 9/11 even. It was 99. Um sorry, we arrived 97. I think we left 99. Yeah, and then I started school in Malaysia 2001. Yeah.
Also, it was even
Mm.
before
It
you
was
started
even
school.
before. Oh yeah,
So
yeah.
super, super young.
Super young. Yeah,
But the thing when you're young is the
yeah.
best time to experience America, in my opinion.
Yeah,
You know, when
probably.
when you're older, it
Yeah.
gets a little chaotic.
Yeah, plus the fact that you understand all the nuances of
Yeah, yeah.
American
When you're
society.
still young, you're still oblivious to
Yeah,
everything.
oblivious to
So
everything.
you
So
just take in the good.
yeah,
So
yeah,
then you're growing up in Malaysia,
yeah.
middle class. You finish high school. You start working in
Mm,
banking.
mm.
And what led you to study a master's in the UK?
Wow, that's a good question. It wasn't. I applied to a few places. Um, I in Europe, I applied to the Netherlands. Here, I applied SOAS in Sussex. So I think after speaking to my parents, they were more keen on me being in the UK rather than I wanted to go to the Netherlands just for an adventure, basically, like completely alien place. Um, and I didn't even know the language. I think that was a bit that my parents were a bit like, you don't even know the language, and I'm like, I don't even know the language. So, but after a while, my parents were helping me with the masters, so I was like, you know what, I respect their wishes, so I came here. Um, but specifically studying development, I think is a logical. I was looking for a field which combined um, my interests in economics, business, politics, and just um, um, the collective journey of human beings or the collective journey of a community. Because of I think of my heritage. Like I always found that fascinating as a kid. Like, why do people migrate? Why do people um, take certain jobs or do certain things? I always had questions about like how communities organize. And I think if you wrap all of that together, development is a pretty relevant course to study and to kind of understand. I think actually coming to SOAS was the best decision because I think I was less um, appraised, or I understood less the impact colonialism had on the trajectory of uh, like humanity, basically. I think in Malaysia we study about colonialism, but more as something that's in the past and something that we forget. Not to say we forget, but it ended. You know, that's the more accurate term for it. It ended. So we are here. We have progressed and we have done well for ourselves. And the theme, you kind of catch that theme from studying history in high school. But the good thing about going to SOAS is you realize that uh, imperialism, which came out of the embers of colonialism. Depends who you ask, but that's how I look at it. Um, never really ended. The rules based system that we have today is very much an extension of imperialism, as we can see now, especially with what's happening in Israel and Palestine. Um, the reaction to that, the uh, the fact that there is an ongoing genocide that is in happening in plain sight, but all these organs of international law seem powerless to stop this genocide from happening. So, if you go from that standpoint, like if you go from that particular situation, sorry, or not even situation, but this particular genocide, right? Then you work backwards and you ask yourself, why? Why does this happen? You know, why is this happening? What enables it? Who benefits? And you realize that, yeah, imperialism hasn't ended. And um, I think that is the bit that, Malaysian education didn't give me. And now that I've studied it,
Maybe that's because of the effect of imperialism.
yeah, yeah,
Who
exactly. Yeah,
knows?
who knows? It could be the case as well. Like part of I think part of modern imperialism is a part of the project of modern imperialism is to kind of invisibilize it. That makes sense. Like you don't notice it. You know, you walk down the street, you walk in London, and you feel like, oh, I'm here in London. I have my graduate visa, just like everyone else. But you're not. Or it's or even our friends um, who are people from the UK or people minorities in the UK, or maybe you have experienced it in France as well. Like maybe some people may not think you French enough, or some people may have, and that notion that idea comes from somewhere, right? Nothing exists in a vacuum. So that is that's what SOAS has given me, and I think I'm pretty appreciative of that. Yeah.
Now that you have studied in the UK,
Mm.
did you have expectations,
Mhm.
and did your experience differ from these expectations?
Yeah, I expected to come to a country that works. I left a country that kind of doesn't work. The funny thing is that there's quite a lot of parallels between the UK and Malaysia, which is pretty fascinating. Uh, I think both economies are kind of have similar problems, but I think it's the biggest bubble that I think burst for me is my faith in the international rule based system. Now, I have to admit, before I came here, I was a big uh, believer in this international rule based system. Not because I knew anything about it, but because I had seen that, okay, Malaysia had thrived. Uh, my parents were my parents came from this kind of like my parents grew up difficult lives, financially, materially. Um, their their parents had it even more tough, and then above them they were immigrants. So my ancestors were Southern Indian, Southern Arab, Southern Thai, even from Indonesia. Well, so now modern day Indonesia, all converging into Malaysia. So I'm technically like third generation immigrant. Um, and wow, I had, I mean, now I would say back home I'm upper middle, right? So it's a big thing to go through all that in three generations. I think you don't get it elsewhere in the world. You get it a lot in probably the West, like in the UK, for example. You see some of our friends who are British Pakistani or British Bengali. Their grandparents came here probably with nothing, and they as maybe some of them will be doing pretty well for themselves, come from very um, affluent families, alhamdulillah. Um, so I think I was a big believer in that. But then I think coming here to the UK really burst my bubble in terms of what a Western country looks like. And this international rule based system is not as rule based as we like to think it is.
Yeah. Very interesting. And also, I know you applied, and maybe you're still going through the process. You applied to the World Bank internship. How is that experience like? Because I know this is
Mm-hmm.
a very prestigious thing, very
Mm-hmm.
competitive.
Mm-hmm.
And how is that experience like for you?
I applied to the YPP Young Professionals Program. It's been tough. I think they're very rigorous in the way the selection process works.
And I know you started applying way back, like what, 6 months ago?
Uh, I don't know if it's 6 months. Um,
It's a long process to say the
it
least.
is. Yeah, I would. No, I think it would be more than that because I started in June. I think
Hey.
that was when I submitted my personal statement and then like some policy essays that they wanted us to write. But yeah, I think I've never gone through a process like this. When I got my banking job back home, it was very uh very quick, I could say. I had a job within a month of graduating, but at the same time I graduated at a time when the labor market in Malaysia was doing quite well. Um so this particular program I think is like a graduate program for the bank. Um I've gone through 1, 2, 3 stages now, 4. So I'm pretty much waiting for the decision. Um, I look forward to it in a sense that if you want to work in the development world, this is one of the organizations that has the reach for that, right? The World Bank is the World Bank. They're all over the world, in almost every country, and they work on almost every measure of development. You know, their work is very much guided by the SDGs and trying to like achieve the SDGs and stuff like that. But on the other hand, I'm very well aware that institutions like the World Bank have a Western bias, have a neoliberal bias, and it would be interesting. Uh, Me as it would be an interesting career development, not just career, I guess, but also uh, character or like it's part of my journey as well. Um, Working for an organization like the World Bank. Yeah.
And these 4 stages, you said 4. What do they look like? Is it like you had to do interviews?
Hmm. So the first one was an essay and uh, basically a personal statement and like a policy statement. I think I had to submit. The second was a higher view interview. So like you have to record yourself on the higher view um, software. And then the third one was an interview in Vienna that I had 2 months ago. Yeah,
Alright, or you had to fly out from London to Vienna for an interview.
that was pretty cool. I never expected. I've never gone through that in my life. Like having been like being flown out, being put up in a hotel, and then
They took care of everything.
yeah, they did.
Wow.
Yeah, it was pretty cool. Um,
And so how
and
was that interview like?
oh, that was tough. I think so. They basically had like a group, um, a group session where we brainstormed ideas and
With
then we
the other
presented it.
candidates?
Yes. So that was the last stage. I think the HR told us there were like about 9,000 people that applied for this program. When we reached the last stage, it was about 140 of us left, 120, I think. My particular slot had six other people, five other people, six including me. And I think they'll take about 40 to 50 of us. So, what was I going to Yeah, the morning was a group work. The first one in the morning, sorry, was a group work. We all had to discuss something I can't remember already. Something to do with, I think, digitalization. So we brainstormed for half an hour and then we presented it, and then we had to reflect on it. 50 minutes later, and then there was interview. The interview was very tough for me. It lasted 6 hours. Everyone was staring.
6 hours.
Six people for 1 hour. Yeah. I'd
It's
be
a panel
dead.
of 6 people,
Yeah.
and then just you.
Yeah, just me.
I
And it was a small table, so they were just all looking at me. And yeah, it was a bit unnerving, I have to say.
What's the
But
first thing they asked you?
just tell me about yourself. And I was like going on and on and on.
Is there something they asked you that caught you off guard?
Actually, what caught me off guard was the finance questions. So I hadn't, I mean, I haven't been working in the banking industry for about close to 3 years now. Because I left in 2020 and then I took a gap year, and then in 2021 I came here, and then now I'm finished 2023. Now we're in 2024. So it's about 3 years now of being outside of banking. So I kind of forgot some stuff about discounted cash flows, the terminologies, like what is free cash flow to firm, free cash flow to equity, and all these things. So it was that one really caught me off guard. I was like, oh man, I tried to waffle my way out of it, but towards the end as well, there was a question about have you ever faced racism in your life in a professional setting? And I was like, wow, that one caught me off guard as well. Like, how do you answer that question? Yeah, like what would you have answered if you had to, if somebody asked you that?
I would have said no, but at one point I would have also be thinking, what do they want me to answer? Like, do they prefer me to have face racism? That's something advantageous in my position. Even looking at affirmative action, this Western idea, maybe it puts me in a better position. So I don't know, maybe I would have waffled and said yes, talk about my experience as a, but no, okay. Interesting. Yeah, it's definitely a tough program. I know. Fingers crossed, you'll let me know. And
Definitely.
now you've been here, you're more accustomed to the culture and the structure. You said people don't work, but even the education is something people don't expect how it's structured. The fact that we have so much openness and free time and space. Is there any advice you would give yourself as someone that is coming from Malaysia studying here?
Yeah, I would say lighten up. Don't take it, probably not to take it too seriously. But I think, well, I would really, I would really reach out to somebody. So let's say, I gonna study development at SOAS. And reach out to somebody over LinkedIn. Just search SOAS development studies, and then if you see the first Malaysian that pops up, just message them like, "Hello, I'm so and so." I think I didn't do that because I was so fixed on the idea of doing development studies that I didn't really explore any other options, which may have maybe more perhaps perhaps would have been more aligned to what my interests are. Yeah. So I think the development studies that I studied, sorry, the development track that I studied specifically at SOAS Environment, Politics, and Development, which is the name of my degree. It is a very interesting one. I would definitely recommend 10 out of 10. It's just that it was very theoretical. Like our core module, political ecology, was deeply fascinating, but so theoretical. Like it's if you wanted to do a PhD, then I would definitely recommend doing my program. But if you wanted something which is more aligned with like studying about circular economics or carbon accounting, which are more market oriented solutions towards the environmental crisis, then I wouldn't study at SOAS. No. Yeah. So that's my advice to someone who's about to come here. Like, really do your research on the course that you want to do. But it's also sometimes you'll be like, oh, I want to study abroad and I'm so excited and I got this program and I want to go. Um, at the same time, I would also mention be open and be um, kind of don't be scared to experience different things with different people. Um, Sometimes you kind of get a bit anxious going abroad, and you kind of stick to your own people too much. Maybe I feel like when you're in a city like London, it's the best time to just do stuff which is outside your comfort zone and to learn more about yourself. If you haven't gone to an art gallery or an art exhibition, go. If you've never gone hiking, go hiking. If you've never done a quirky um, city tour, one of those cheesy city tours, do it anyway. You never know what you might find. Um, but yeah, that's probably what I'd say.
Yeah, and you never know who you're gonna meet.
Yeah.
That's also something good about studying abroad.
Mm-hmm.
Meet so many good people, and we've
Yeah.
met so
Yeah.
many great
We
people,
have.
unexpected people.
Mm-hmm.
That's really something great. And as well, bro, I'm lucky to
Mm-hmm.
have met you.
100%,
And
bro. Yeah.
bro, thank you for coming on, bro. It was a
Yeah,
very interesting
thanks
pleasure.
for having
And
me, man. Yeah, I wish I could have. I feel like in some areas I could have done a bit better in explaining stuff.
you know,
Like, yeah,
it's funny. Many
Yeah.
people that are gonna come on the podcast say, like,
Yeah.
let me prepare, let
yeah,
me do some reading
mm-hmm.
and stuff like this. Hasnain, that's what he's telling me, because we're gonna talk about politics and stuff like this. But I think the best comes out of just the conversation and what you already know. And like I said before we started the podcast, usually podcasts you have big names, and
Yeah.
these guys, professors, what they know all the stats, they know everything.
Yeah.
But those things also get boring.
Yeah.
So I don't think that's the most important part. So the people can look up the statistics, but until then, bro, thank you so much, bro.
Nah, bro.
And who
100%.
knows, maybe
Thank
we'll
you
do
for
it
having
again,
me.
bro.
Yeah, 100%.
Thank you for listening to the Inspire Alex podcast. See you next episode.